All right, let's go over some problems for this moral philosophy. Let's start with this one here. Do only rational agents have moral worth? So many critics of Kant will argue that he has something of a coverage problem. So I'll draw an analogy to healthcare to make this point. So in our country, there are a lot of people who do not have health insurance. They don't have health care. They're not covered. And if too many people are not covered, that's a problem for everybody. So ideally, we would have a health care plan where everyone is covered, or at least almost everyone, right? If too many people aren't covered, then there's a problem with our system. Similarly, for Kant's moral philosophy, there may be beings who are not covered, not under his healthcare plan, but under his moral plan. So who deserves respect? Who has dignity? Who is a moral agent? Who is a part of the kingdom of ends, to use Kantian language? It's going to be humans who can reason like you and I reason. You have dignity, I have dignity. Most human beings have dignity, but not all. So what about infants? What about the elderly that might have dementia? What about people who have brain injuries and they become kind of irrational and they can't reason like they used to? Technically, they have, or they never, for the infants, they haven't yet developed that dignity. They don't have that agency. And so are we allowed to, do we have to treat them with respect? If we follow Kant's moral philosophy to the letter, we might not have to. The categorical imperative prohibits using rational agents as mere means to an end. It prohibits the violation of rational agents' rights, but it says nothing about beings that aren't agents. So either we have to update Kant's moral philosophy, or it's very, very problematic. We also have the coverage problem when it comes to animals, non-human animals. So what about our pets, our cats and our dogs? What about other mammals that seem to be quite intelligent? So what about whales and apes and gorillas and dolphins? And what about some of the animals that some of us consume? So cows, pigs, and chickens. Is there any rules against mistreating them? Well, it's hard to come up with a Kantian basis. So it's hard to come up with a Kantian basis to prohibit the exploitation of these non-human animals. So to put it this way, if you're an animal rights person, then you might not want to be a Kantian, because there doesn't seem to be much room in his moral program to defend animal rights. Why? Because who has rights? It is rational agents. It is beings who can reason on par with healthy adult humans. And infants, some of the elderly, people with brain injuries, and many non-human animals, they fall short of this. And so it's either up in the air whether or not they have dignity, or it just might be that they don't. And so a lot of people criticize Kant's ethics in that regard. Let's look at another problem. Many people say that the categorical imperative is too strict. From the categorical imperative, we derive these absolute, exceptionless rules. But what about if we really, really want to grant an exception? And there was a Swiss-French thinker with an interesting name, Benjamin Constant, and he wrote about Kant's moral philosophy, and he wrote about an example that goes like this. Let's call it the inquiring murderer case, or sometimes I'll call it the inquiring axe murderer case. And I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Suppose you get a knock at the door, and it's an axe murderer. And they're holding up their axe and kind of giving you a funny face, and there's blood dripping from their axe. And you're like, oh no, you're that axe murderer. You're not here to axe murder me, are you? And the axe murderer says, oh, no, I don't want to kill you. And you're like, okay, thank goodness. What do you want? I want to kill your neighbor. And you're like, what? Why? Was my neighbor a bad person? You know, do they have a weird, immoral life that I don't know about? And then you're gonna take justice into your own hands? And the axe murderer says, no, I just enjoy killing people, and your neighbor gave me a bad look the other day, so I'm gonna axe murder them. Now suppose, and the axe murderer says, where's your neighbor? Help me out. I'm gonna go find him and kill him. And suppose the only way to save our neighbor in that case is to lie. We have to misdirect the axe murderer. Otherwise, our innocent neighbor is dead. Is it okay to misdirect the axe murderer? Is it okay to say, oh, the neighbor is 15 miles south when they are in fact, 10 miles north? Let's say. The vast majority, if not all of us, are almost going to be screaming at the video right now. Of course! Not only is it okay to lie, that's what you should do. It's almost a must-lie situation. So the general rule of thumb is lying is bad, lying is immoral. But aren't there exceptions? Isn't it sometimes okay to lie? And this is a pretty good example. So lying in general is bad, but sometimes, especially if it's the only way to save an innocent person's life, it can be morally acceptable. What would Kant say about Benjamin Constant's example? Well, you might think that he would bend a little bit, but believe it or not, he didn't. He's on record as saying that, nope, even in this case, it's still immoral to lie. All right, next problem. Are there cases where the categorical imperative gets the wrong answer, as it were? Is it subject to counterexamples? And the thought experiment here that I'm going to appeal to, I'm going to give credit to my ethics professor when I was sitting where you are in the early 2000s, and it goes something like this. So this is from my professor, Professor Hanser. Suppose that you are at an arena event. You're at something like the Super Bowl, you're at some major sporting event. Let's say it's a baseball game, and it is the 8th inning, and your team is losing like 10-0. Let's say it's the visiting team. So everyone in the stands is super happy that it's 10-0. You're miserable because you are rooting for the away team. Maybe you're visiting that town. And it's just hard to watch. It's the 8th inning. There's only, an inning and a little bit left. And so you want to leave. And you form a maxim. So in circumstances X, I will do Y in order to achieve Z. So the circumstances are you're at this sporting event. The action is that you're going to leave the game early. And your goal is to, not only avoid the punishment of watching your team continue to get crushed, but you also get the advantage of, if you leave in the 8th, you avoid the traffic cluster that will ensue if you wait until the end of the game, that's when most people will leave, especially if it's a good game like that for the home team. If I ask you for your moral intuition, is it okay to leave? Is it morally wrong? Are you morally required to stay till the end of the game? That seems ridiculous. But if we try to universalize this maxim, we're going to hit a contradiction of conception. Leaving will undermine what we were trying to do in the first place if we universalize the maxim. If we universalize it, then everyone leaves early. And if everyone leaves early, we create the very traffic that we were trying to avoid in the first place. And since we undermine what we were trying to do in the first place, that means we hit a contradiction of conception. And we have a perfect duty. Not even an imperfect duty. We have a perfect duty to stay to the end of the game. That seems crazy. So even if in many cases the categorical imperative seems to capture our moral intuitions, there are at least some where it seems to lead us astray. And so that's why it's on this list of problems for Kant. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Do consequences really count for nothing? Remember, for the utilitarians, they solely look at consequences. For Kant, it's the opposite. You don't look at the consequences at all. You only look at the intention of someone. You only look at what goes into the action. And Kant's reasoning there is we don't really have control over how things pan out. We don't have control over things how play out, but we do have control, or we have much more control over what we try to do. What we try to do. At least as long as you have good intentions, then that's the way to go. Well, is that too extreme? Just like we were critical of utilitarianism for focusing too much on consequences, can't we also run into problems if we focus too much on intentions? So case in point, compare attempted murder to successful murder, let's say first-degree murder. Now, most people want to say that successful murder is worse. So if you are a judge, if you're judge and jury, and you get to decide the punishment for an attempted murderer and a successful murderer, would you give them the same punishment? Most of us wouldn't. Most of us would say, well, I'm not going to let either of you get away with this. You know, the attempted murderer, it's like, whoa, you got some wickedness in your heart. We still need to punish you. So you might imprison them for, 5 years, let's just say. I'm just throwing it out there. But the successful murderer, you might be like, whoa, not only do you have the wickedness in your heart, but you also were able to be effective and act on that evil in your soul. And so you deserve definitely more serious punishment. So you might lock them away for 10 years, 20 years, maybe for life, right? Now, what would a Kantian be forced to do? Well, even though the consequences were night and day different, right? In the successful murderer case, someone's dead, and in the attempted murderer case, no one's dead. The consequences couldn't be more different. The intention was the same. The intention was the same. Both people intended to kill someone, and if that's the only basis for punishment, then you would be forced, the Kantian judge, jury would be forced to dole out the same punishment. So if the successful murderer got life in prison, you would be forced to put the attempted murderer in prison for life as well. And that seems not quite right. That's too extreme a view on consequences. And our final issue here is about pure practical reason. So we talked about this in the meta-ethics lecture, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier when I was talking about Hume and David Lewis, the two Davids, David Hume, David Lewis. So remember, pure practical reason, when you act from pure practical reason or you act on pure practical reason, that's when you do something even though there is no desire driving you to act. And so for Kant, this happens often when people act morally. Sometimes you do the right thing and you want to do the right thing. So that would not be an example of pure practical reason. But like in the soldier case, initially, we thought the soldier doesn't want to jump down into the war zone at all, but they end up doing it because it's their duty. They reasoned out that was the right thing to do. They acted from belief or knowledge of right and wrong alone. So that's pure practical reason. And like we said, Hume or Lewis would say, you just haven't told the whole story of desire. For Lewis, there are warm desires that we can feel intensely in the moment, and they're often linked to instant gratification. And the warm desire for the soldier is to curl up in a ball and be safe and to go home. But they might also have a cold desire, which can be a desire for something like to perform your duty, a desire to do the right thing. It's more calculative. It's more thought out. It's not about instant gratification. And so when you tell the full story about desire, then there is no pure practical reason. It was desire and reason acting together. So a lot of students, they get confused. They say, oh, I get it. For Kant, morality is when you act out of belief alone or reason alone. And for Hume and Lewis, that's acting out of desire alone. But that is not right at all. For both of them, you can act on desire plus belief, or desire plus belief and reason. And that's what happens always for Hume and Lewis. It's just for Kant, just sometimes there's no desire there. But both are okay with acting on desire and reason together. Here's one more example of what sounds like pure practical reason, but upon further reflection might not be a very good example. Let's say that you are a new parent and your new infant wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning because they're hungry, so they're crying, so they need to be attended to. Now, in that moment, does the new parent, does new mom or new dad, do they want to get out of bed and go tend to baby? Now, if you are a new parent, you have been, or you can just put yourselves in these shoes or ask anyone, they would say, no, I don't want it. It's the last thing I want to do. Like, I'm just like half asleep. All I want to do is go back to sleep. And it's just awful. You might be already at your wit's end. So, no, you don't want to do it at all, but yet you still do it because that's your parental duty. Aha, Kant would say. This is an example of pure practical reason. What's motivating the parent is their duty to the child, and not because of course, they want their child to be happy and not crying. But in that moment, they might say, in that moment, it's not about want, it's about duty. And Kant would say, there we go. This is the basis for morality. This is why I wrote this giant tome, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And you can expect what we're going to say here. What someone like Hume or Lewis is going to say is, again, you haven't told the whole story about desire. Yes, there's a warm desire to stay in the warm bed and to go back to sleep, but there's a cold desire to perform your parental duties, to do what's in the best interest of the child, to do what is good in the long term. And so David Lewis, in this article from 1988, he writes about this. So we don't have to read the whole thing. We just read a few paragraphs. So in his example, you are in a philosophy department and you have to hire a new philosophy professor, and you narrow it down to 2 candidates. One is very affable and likable, and they're your friend, and it feels, you feel good just hanging out with them, and they're also pretty good at doing philosophy. The other candidate is distant, and it's not like they're mean or cruel. They're just kind of distant and aloof, and their personality is kind of stiff and robotic. However, based on the objective criteria in the hiring process, the second person, who's more robotic, they are objectively the better candidate. If you're going to be completely fair and judge them only based on things that are relevant, then you should go with the person who's more distant. And that's what the philosophy department does. And so someone like Kant would say, see, you did the right thing. You wanted to hire the person that was more warm and friendly, but you didn't. You didn't act from desire. You didn't really want to hire this person that was stiff and aloof, but you did it because you wanted to be fair. You knew that was the right thing to do. And Lewis, of course, is going to say, well, you haven't told the whole story of desire. So let's go through this quickly and we'll wrap things up. A Humean, not human, David Humean, thesis about motivation says that we are moved entirely by desire. We are disposed to do what we are supposed to do what will serve our desires according to our beliefs. If there were no desires to serve, we would never be moved more to do one thing than another. So in short, no desire, no action. For Kant, you can have action without desire. That's a good way to sum it up. Whatever might happen then would be entirely unmotivated. Here I shall uphold Humeanism, that's a mouthful, Humeanism against one sort of opponent. Our anti-Humean challenges us with this case. The department must choose between two candidates for a job, Professor Mean and Professor Nice, with the funny spellings here. Professor Nice is your old friend, affable, sensible, fair-minded, cooperative, moderate. Mean is quite the opposite, but it is clear that Mean is just a little bit better at doing philosophy. Gritting your teeth and defying all desire, you vote for Mean, because you believe that Mean getting the job, instead of Nice, would, all things considered, be good. Your belief about what's good has moved you to go against your desire to have Nice for a colleague and have nothing to do with Mean. So again, it looks like a win for the Kantian. It looks like pure practical reason. You acted from belief, knowledge of right and wrong, not from desire. But, Lewis concludes, we humans reply that there are desires and there are desires. So he's saying you haven't told the full story. You've left out one of the desires. Some desires, for instance, your desire to have Professor Nice as a colleague, are warm. You feel enthusiasm. You take pleasure in the prospect of fulfillment. Desires, for instance, your desire to hire the best available candidate, are cold. Nobody ever said that only warm desires can move us. It is not so that you defied all desire when you voted for Mean. You were moved entirely by your desires. However, the cold desire outweighed the warm one. We are within our rights to construe desire inclusively to cover the entire range of states that move us, including, for instance, the state that moved you to vote for Mean. Humanism, understood in this inclusive way, is surely true. Maybe a trivial truth, but a trivial truth is still a truth. So once you tell the whole story and you include cold desires, then it should be clear, says Lewis, that pure practical reason, it's just not a thing. There's always a desire. Now, if Kant, this is written in the 20th century, if Kant were to hear Lewis present this argument, he might say, he might even be fine with it. I think for Kant, either he would stick to his guns or he would say something like, okay, that's fine. I just worried about a morality based on warm desire alone. If you include these cold desires, they are cognitive enough that I can be on board with them being the basis of moral action. All right, that was quite a bit. That's all I have for you. As always, thanks for hanging out with me. Here's a link to that clip.